Yes, these days everything lives on YouTube in perpetuity.
What is this? Got it.
So I would like to officially welcome everyone to this session of the 7th Annual World-Ecology Research Network meeting, Imperialism and Anti-Imperialisms. We will get started with our plenary speaker in just a few moments. I want to let everyone know that we are going ahead with our conference next year, which will just be like 6 months from now, in Bonn in June. I will even share with you the call for papers, which will be going out and being distributed to everyone. It's the same theme as before everything got done with. So working environments, unruly natures, no politics of work without nature, no politics of nature without work. And we will be distributing this CFP here in the next little bit and encouraging people to submit their abstracts to us. We're looking for a live and in-person event in Bonn, Germany in June. And because of our experiences doing this conference, we're hoping to have some kind of an online element as well, but we don't know what that component will look like specifically, but we will be getting those details together, you know, at one of those meetings, but it'll be one that's worth having. So I wonder if we have any announcements before we get started.
Maybe one. So there was a bit of reshuffling. I'm just reiterating an email Diana sent. There was a bit of reshuffling to accommodate some folks that couldn't make their panels. So each YouTube playlist, which you can go to the original email that we sent with the playlist, and I think we sent another also. All of the changes are reflected in the YouTube playlists. So go to YouTube to see any changes. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions about that or? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we tried to keep the emails. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, which one did mine get moved to?
You're muted, John. Do you want me to look?
I'll look in a second. I'll put it in the chat for you, Alan. I just
Okay,
good call, John. Good call.
Yeah.
I'll look at them all, but I was looking, but I couldn't find it. So
yes, we had.
My talk, and I'm really sorry, everybody.
Yeah, we had a few scheduling issues that people had, that were time zone issues or just misreading things. And, you know, we've really tried to accommodate. This is one of the nice things about doing everything online, is that we were able to lean into some of those things. And, you know, we did our best to just help people out as best as we could in terms of that, because things come up. Yeah. So let us, I lost Andrej. Oh, there he is. Okay. I am going to pin you, and we are going to have Andrej give our talk today. Andrej Grubacic has been a remarkable scholar for a long time. His most recent book, co-authored with Dennis O'Hearn, Living at the Edges of Capitalism, Adventures in Exile and Mutual Aid, is from California Press, or UC Press, is a great book, and I highly recommend it. And I have to say, I think one of my favorites is The Wobblies and Zapatistas, and I'm looking to assign that to my students in the Latin American Studies class that I'm teaching next semester. So I recommend that as well. But Andrej's work is just really remarkable. He takes up all of these really serious issues, and I'm really excited to hear his talk today, where we talk about and explore the issues of discipline and ontology and all the things that we've been talking and thinking about. So Andrej, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Diana. How much time do we have again for these things?
we are saying about 45 minutes for talking and then 45 minutes for discussion.
Okay, then I will try to read to be a little bit faster. Please, if you can't hear me, do let me know for whatever reason. And my talk today is about interdisciplinarity, and it really started as an idea percolating during my summer vacation. Namely, I have a house in Dubrovnik in Croatia, where I'm from, former Yugoslavia, and present-day Croatia. And I was reading memoirs, or memories really, of Fernand Braudel's wife, Polly, who wrote quite beautifully and quite movingly about the first days and about the intention of Fernand Braudel really in writing the La Méditerranée, his famous books about the Mediterranean. And she said something that really surprised me or even shocked me. Namely, she said, we were in Dubrovnik in 1930s. We're sitting in a cafe, and Fernand Braudel, he just jumped out of this cafe and said, listen, Paul, we are in 16th century. And he apparently ran away to Ragusa archives, the archives of Dubrovnik. And this is the first time that he actually had, she claims, the idea of connected Mediterranean that became the book. This is the time when he conceived his masterpiece in Dubrovnik, of all places. So I was feeling at the time surprisingly surprised, but also sort of embarrassed, both as a Braudelian and as a local. So I went to, thank God for tourism, to a local bookstore when there was an English bookstore, right? But there was a new book by Fernand Braudel published in English. And now that book is called Out of Italy. And I have read some of the drafts that were previously published, but this is the first time, I think, the first English edition. This is a delightful book. It's a book about, it's really his polemics with Burckhardt and his civilization of Renaissance against the individualism expressed there, and this kind of compelling argument that Braudel knew how to make about civilizations needed to have feet on the ground very firmly. And he, among other things, wrote this, and I just wanted to share this because I think it's very beautiful and very Braudelian. So I'm going to read a quote. Writing about, with certain civilizational optimism, shall we say, mortal perhaps are their ephemeral blooms, the intricate and short-lived creations of an age, their economic triumphs and their social trials in the short term. But their foundations remain. They are not indestructible, but they are many times more solid than one might imagine. They have withstood 1,000 supposed deaths, their massive bulk unmoved by the monotonous pounding of the centuries. A renaissance, Braudel writes, is always possible. I thought it was beautiful, and then I went and quickly to read up on all the reviews, and I found a very competent review by otherwise very competent British historian, who nevertheless included in this review something that caught my attention. Namely, he said here, and this is a quote, Fernand Braudel's greatest achievement as part of the wider Annales movement was introduction of interdisciplinarity. The interdisciplinary approach, long advocated by Faber, Bloch, and Braudel, was institutionalized in some British universities, notably the new universities such as Sussex, Essex, and East Anglia. This made me curious and slightly furious, because I did not know that Braudel's project was now reduced to interdisciplinarity. And further down in the same review, it stated that Braudel and his colleagues have even influenced developments in sociology, minor developments, such as world systems theory. Now, this made me even more curious and even more slightly furious. Is world systems analysis, no theory, now reduced to be a minor disturbance, minor development within the discipline of sociology? And in order to answer these questions that I wanted to present to you today, I thought it might be wise to go to the very beginning. You know, Goethe used to say, in order to truly possess something, you need to make it yours, right? And going back to that history of the Annales, to the story and to the legend of Annales, I think is very instructive. They were sometimes called a school, sometimes a movement, or even a combat legion. And there are at least 2 legends attached to this school and quite a few misunderstandings. There is a black legend of the French journal, which in its early years was combative and marginal, and which defined its role as a sort of an inspiring rebellion against archaic ways of history and social sciences. And then there is, of course, another legend. The black legend faded with the success of the undertaking, and the golden legend, sustained by formidable intellectual and institutional success of Brodel Bloch and Faber, consecrated the founding fathers, consecrated the eponymous journal, consecrated the research institutions such as the famous 6E section of the EPHE in Paris. And some would say, and perhaps not without reason, that Annales have become the establishment. And at the very least, they were awarded the status of a decisive intellectual authority, well, at least in France. Now, going back to the legend that I'm most interested in, which is the Black legend, Annales were really a protest movement within the world of social sciences of the 20th century, and they were not the only ones. The first movement against the British-dominated world of social science was probably the work associated with Staat und Wissenschaften, whose intellectual lines can be traced to Friedrich List, but also forward to Veblen, to Schumpeter, even to Polanyi. It originated in 19th century Germany and, insisting on regional particularity, introduced new concepts such as national economy. Of course, Marxism followed, and Marxism was both political and intellectual project. Both of these movements emphasized the primacy of analysis of economies over long historical time and space, the holism of socio-historical processes, and transitory nature of theory. Now, Annales arrived a bit later, but in dialogue with the aforementioned movements and projects, but in some ways they were even more ambitious. So I would like to, at the very beginning, politely disagree with the oft-repeated assertion that this group was a French phenomenon. Namely, the school, at least the way that I see it, was a French member and the main protagonist of the international movement of confluence of various trends in various countries. If Annales were the French manifestation, the English journal Past and Present was the English one, and FBC, Fernand Braudel Center in Binghamton, was the American part of this larger intellectual constellation. Now, another common misperception is that all the ideas of the Annales are firstly formulated in the first issue, which was published in 1929 in Strasbourg. This is not quite true, and I think it's important to set the record straight in order to have a good intellectual history that can inform our decisions today. The whole of Annales, in a certain sense, were anticipated by a fascinating article written by economist and sociologist François Simian, Historical Method and Social Sciences, which was published almost 26 years later. I think it was 1903. Now, we should be sensitive to the context where this intervention was made. It was made in France at the time when, both in France and the entire Europe, history or historical science was becoming the legitimizing agency of the nation state. This was the time when Lessing held that the best historian was he who described the history of his own state and his own times and his own people. Or just to think about the famous report of 1867 by 3 young French historians who argued that the main of history is the past, the present belongs to the politics, and the future to God. Now, of course, this entails a certain conception of history, which dominant distinctive features are the equation of politics and history and the linear vision of time. Time here is not conceptual, it's entirely real, not a tool for historical analysis, but an entity in its own right. That's what Simian, what we are in the habit of calling positivism, what François Simian was up against in this exceptionally acute critique of traditional history made from the standpoint of social science. He simultaneously, in this manifesto, let's call it that, laid out a program which placed history at the very heart of other social sciences, or to use the expression that he used himself, of social science in singular. Now, in Simian's opinion, 1903, nothing divides the social sciences fundamentally, neither their objects, not even their methods. The importance of the manifesto, the importance of this statement was twofold. First of all, it's important because of the place it occupied in the thinking of the Annales, of the founders of the Annales, from Lucien Febvre to Fernand Braudel. And indeed, Braudel republished this in 1960, the unchanged article, in a rubric that itself is significant. It was called Débat et Combat, Debate and Struggle. The article was accompanied by a very simple note reminding the readers of the crucial importance of the text. But secondly, this polemical text, which was formulated in the midst of the Durkheimian struggle, seems to me to constitute a sort of a crucial theoretical matrix, and also presents the first program for unitary social science. Now, it defines the relationship between the historian and other social sciences in terms which, 100 years later, have barely changed. In this perspective, the isolated fact means nothing. He proposed that history reshapes itself along the lines of other social sciences, or more precisely, that history becomes fully a social science, changing its methods to produce objects of study comparable to those produced by sociologists, economists, and others. Now, curiously, significantly, he assumed without any question the existence of a unified mode of reference. There is nothing resembling interdisciplinarity, at least in the way that we talk about interdisciplinarity today, in the way that he spoke about overthrowing the three idols of the historian tribe: the political, the individual, and the chronological. This is, I think, worth quoting in full. From this point of view, one sees immediately that an individual phenomenon, unique, does not have a cause, since it cannot be explained by constant relation with another phenomenon. History must turn its back to the unique phenomenon and grasp repetitive effects, put away what is accidental in order to attach itself to what is regular, eliminate what is individual in order to study what is social. Now, I would say that the whole of Annales is virtually contained in this definition. History is a problem, the search for models, the long term. All of this can be found in what François Simian wrote about, I would say even prophetically, back in those days, including convergence of the social sciences and the encouragement of collective research work. Now, Bloch, Febvre, Braudel were fully aware of impossibility of simply eliminating from history all individual facts. They were more subtle on this than Simian, and this manifests itself in this twofold orientation of their critique. Opinion on the subject, in a certain sense, included everything that they were up against at that time. They struggled against positivist history, against those three idols described by Simian. But on the other hand, they criticized the anti-historical attitude of social scientists. It was a struggle against British-dominated conception of science in the form of universalizing generalizations, but also against, of course, the conception of history as the study of non-repeatable phenomena. So against positivist historians, they pushed for a claim for social science, and against the universalizers, they were pushing the claim for history. A little bit like the Impressionist painters, they who gave famously the order for everybody to go outside, right, and to paint the nature live. Bloch, Febvre, and Braudel invited historians to leave the presidential cabinet, to leave the parliament, and to go outside and to observe live social and economic structures. Historian, or better yet, historical social scientist, was a film director. He zoomed for close-ups, moved away, came back when the subject changed his pose, moved away again, and came back again, until we were able to discern what Febvre called a new order, dynamic and genetic at the same time, in which nothing is separate, which ought to be together. Now, François Simian's idea of history, with all of these important corrections, was made to be, 26 years later, philosophical touchstone of the Annales. If you look at the editorial policy of Marc Bloch and Lucie Favre, first characteristic feature is the attention given to publications pertaining to different social sciences. No other historical journals before that have ever attached so great an importance to new developments outside what was considered to be history proper. But this is only one manifestation of the deliberate intention of Bloch and Favre to destroy, and I would like to emphasize, to destroy traditional barriers isolating history from the social sciences. Another, and no less important, is the effort of both of the editors to organize collective research and to initiate the famous putting together of standardized information in order to make possible data comparison. They attacked the disciplinary compartmentalization, which still separated historians from those who devoted themselves to the study of contemporary societies and economies. They assigned to the journal the task of unifying, by empirical means, by example and fact, the field of social sciences. And the very structure of the journal made that project very clear. I love rereading the first issue when they have this beautiful editorial, where they say that evils engendered by a divorce that has become traditional, divorce between historians and social scientists, and the divorce within history among cloister group of specialists. It is against those fearful schisms that we intend to stand, not by means of methodological articles or theoretical disquisitions. We are for history in the present, history as the science of the past, history as the science of the present. This, of course, was complete overturning of the Rankian dictum of telling history as it really happened. Historical social science, this is Favre, the science of the past, the science of the present, is a combat. And in 1957, when Brodel took the editorship, he stated that he wanted a particular kind of science, history, pushed to its outer limits into the very heart of all sciences that study man, and up to that contemporary instant filled with the dangerous flames of the event. So to sum up this part of the presentation, the first manifesto for unitary historical social science was the work of a Durkheimian, who was restricted to the fringes, Simian, of the university. And we find ourselves with a apparent paradox. A program of unification for social sciences is based upon a sociological model conceived at the beginning of 20th century by someone relatively marginal, taken up by a group of historians, themselves very much marginal at the outset, but progressively less so. And it is not without significance that both of these basic statements were pronounced from the periphery of the institutions of knowledge. 1969, Brodel, before the events, dangerous flames of the events of 1968, passed the journal into the new hands and expressed his wish that the journal remains at the forefront of innovation with all the inevitable risks. He was not talking about interdisciplinary collaboration here. His risks were far more ambitious. His innovation or wish or desire for innovation was far more ambitious. And he made it very clear in his famous essay that we all quote again and again about history and the long term, published in 1969. He said that, and this is the opening sentence, there is a general crisis of human sciences. And the first paragraph ends saying that one can see today the necessity of convergence of the human sciences. On the practical level, he says, for this article has a practical intention. I would hope that the social sciences stop for the moment arguing so much about what is or is not social science. Let them rather try to spell out the elements that would permit us to achieve a preliminary convergence. Myself, I believe these elements are mathematization, narrowing in on locality, and longue durée. Now, this is a striking paragraph for many reasons. It's going beyond or inviting us to go beyond the positivist division between particular and general methods, but it's also a programmatic statement in its own right. It's a proposal. And that proposal was followed up by another article, The Unity and Diversity of Social Sciences, where he said, I think it was 2 years after that, 71, that in constructing our unity, all kinds of research are of interest to us. And this sounds really, really important. Let us hasten the movement that is trending everywhere in the world to move forward to unity. If necessary, let us skip stages whenever that is possible and intellectually useful, because tomorrow it will be too late. Now, he rejects the idea that history and sociology are different disciplines. They constitute, and I love this phrase, a single adventure of the mind, not the obverse sides of a single cloth, but the entire cloth itself, in all the complexity of its threads. There is no social science of the kind that interests me without reconciliation. We are in need of new music. And then he becomes even more clear. For me, there is only unitary interscience. If one marries history and geography, one is wasting one's time. One must do everything at the same time. I am myself in favor of generalized promiscuity. Those who do interscience by marrying one science with another are too prudent. It is bad morals that must prevail. Let us mix together all the sciences, including the traditional ones. Interscience, Brodel's project, therefore, was a singular historical social science. It is whole of them, not an interdisciplinary conversation. It is an interwoven cloth with countless threads. What he was suggesting was far more ambitious and more revolutionary than just collaboration. So to answer my first question, interscience was definitely not interdisciplinary. What he called for, against the police logic of the academic disciplines, is for the politics of social science, politics that rejects the outdated distribution of disciplinary competences. Now, Brodel, and I think this is important for us to say, completely, I would say, underestimated the opposition. This was received as an outrageous proposal, not to be discussed in polite academic company. Where there are bad morals or where new music becomes too loud, the conservative neighbors call the police. And the logic of the police, and this is where Jacques Rancière's notion is useful, the management of common affairs by competent people. That's what the police is. Just think about the reception that Brodel's work and the work of the Annales received in the United States. The golden legend of the success of the Annales somewhat obscures the frosty response of the competent people who live here in our universities. Most significant works of the Annales were not permitted to enter anywhere near the summit of a serious consideration by our very important social scientists. I still like to read a review by Bernard Bailyn, published in 1966 of La Méditerranée. It's very interesting what he said. Namely, he found the book incomprehensible. The bulk of his review consisted in a discussion of the politics and diplomacy, which forms the final section of the Mediterranean, declaring both demography and geography completely irrelevant to what he considered to be relevant, which is politics. And let us go further. In New York Review of Books, J.H. Eliot reviewed the first volume and concluded that this lyrical masterpiece is an epic failure because it does not explain the Battle of Lepanto. J.H. Plumb reviewed the first volume in the New York Times Book Review, somewhere I think in 1973, and used the review to launch into massive hysterical, really, attack on Brodel's geographic, economic, and biological determinism. I suspect that the reason why Brodel and Annales were rejected by the American Academy is not because, and actually this has been stated too many times, of this occasionally exotic and difficult language, which I assume means French, but because it challenges certain very fundamental assumptions of 20th century liberal intelligentsia, including its disciplinarian Lockean reading of history. Now, to be fair, the work of the post-Brodel Annales, the so-called New Annales, has not been exactly forthcoming. I'm in agreement, basically, with Richard Cobb, who spoke about historians in white coats streaming out of the laboratories of the 6E section as the dark mechanized forces of the social sciences. There is no denying that the New Annales pushed it a little bit too far. They moved from total history to totalizing history, from history that is a totalizing discussion or description of all that exists, together with an empiricist quantification quite remote from the original concerns of the school. My old professor and friend Tran Stojanovic, quite rightly, in my opinion, criticized the New Annales for the fragmentation or splintering, as he called it. And interestingly, he used this term, that set forth a sort of placid interdisciplinarity. Possibly, he said, the answer is that from 1960s on, theories about structural history and the longue durée have been raised to the kind of dogma. After the Bible inevitably follows interpretation. After La Méditerranée inevitably followed scholasticism of structural history. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein had a slightly different take on all of this. He said, and he stated, that resistance has its perils, and the greatest peril of resistance in both systems is success. Within a capitalist world economy, those who resist are either crushed or rewarded in order to be crushed more subtly. And those who resist often lend themselves, Immanuel said, to the boa constrictor's embrace. The school of Annales, he continued, for school there is, despite Bloch, Faber, and Brodel, is guilty of creeping cooptation, just like other schools of resistance. Now, perhaps it's the time to attach another legend, a gray legend, to the black and gold one, the gray legend of cooptation. That's the Annales. But what about the second question that our historians from the beginning have posed, or provocation, the one related to the world systems as a development within the discipline of sociology? Now, when Ferdinand Brodel Center was set up in 1976, Terry Hopkins and Immanuel Wallerstein were very consciously developing something that resembled almost to the finest detail the example of the Annales. First issue of the review made it clear that the journal stands against geographical, temporal universalization of truth, which is sectorial division of modern science, stated in terms of propositions that are eternally and pervasively true. In his famous speech given in honor of Sid Mintz, Anthropology and Other Dubious Disciplines, Wallerstein explicitly referenced Brodel's Interscience, and he champions reorganization of historical social science around those three things that we already mentioned: mathematization, narrowing in on locality, and longue durée. Now, the term that was used in FBC and at Brodel Center when I arrived there was unidisciplinarity. We were all students of the long-term, large-scale social change. Now, we are anti-capitalists, but we are also declared enemies of sociology. At some point, I remember there was this unfortunate proposal that we start calling our project World Historical Sociology. The poor fellow who proposed it was shouted out of the room of the center. And, you know, it was really interesting. I was a visiting professor at NYU, and I was hanging out with professors who belonged to the Howard Zinn School of History from below. And whenever I would say that I'm at Ferdinand Brodel Center, they used to laugh. And a few years later, I was in Leiden, and there was a very well-meaning historian, Dutch, who asked me in all seriousness, do I feel embarrassed to be a student of Immanuel Wallerstein? Well, I was not embarrassed. I was very proud. I was waving the black flag of resistance. And there was also a golden legend at that time being attached to the world systems. Remember, we used to have 2 journals. We used to have 2 research centers. We used to have well-published research working groups and even a section within the American Sociological Association. However, tenor has changed and changed quite significantly since those early days of my life in the world of the world systems analysis. I'm presently the editor of the Journal of World Systems Research, and it is housed within the ASA, American Sociological Association. And I hate to say, but most of contributions that we receive, if not all, are written by professional sociologists. I was recently on a panel, World Systems panel, at some conference where I presented on my perhaps peculiar synthesis of Hegelian Marxism, Brodelian history, Kropotkinian anthropology. And I was met with blank stares. I'm pretty sure that my colleagues had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. After a cautious, confused applause, they returned to the discussion about dependent variables and statistic tables, a conversation that felt very similar to that fragmentation and splintering of the later annals. I was surrounded by sociologists in white coats. I wonder if it's the time to put up a gray flag of world systems and declare that we were crushed, or perhaps subtly crushed, by being rewarded and domesticated into the discipline of sociology. Like that elephant in The Little Prince, swallowed by a snake, which is Emmanuel's boa constrictor. Perhaps, in other words, the gentle historian from the beginning of my story was not entirely wrong. We have not changed the social sciences, but we have changed the departments in Essex, Sussex, and East Anglia. Now, I don't want to sound too cynical, because we should take heart in the fact that we are now here in the presence of the World-Ecology Research Network, which is, in my opinion, the most recent member of the international movement of resistance, and heir to the struggle of previous generations of unidisciplinarians and disciplinarian antinomians. But I do feel obliged to ask, even if in the form of intellectual provocation to you all, how long can we actually be pirates of social sciences? How long can we keep up our black flag of world ecology? Once again, we start from the periphery, from the margins, like François Simian in 1903, like Lucien Favre, like Emmanuel Wallerstein, and I think this is a very good thing. But how can we continue making new music and keeping up bad morals? We still live in a situation, well, if we look at the problems surrounding us, we have the same foes, same antagonists as our colleagues from more than 50 years ago, even if the word interdisciplinarity now serves to conceal compartmentalization and epistemological poverty. There still is a general crisis of social sciences in a world that is quite literally on fire. The university structure against which François Simian brought his Manifesto for unitary historical social science is very similar to the university structures we find ourselves in. And the following words of J.H. Plum from 50 years ago are still pertinent. There he goes. Specialization has proliferated like cancer, making detail livid, but blurring the outlines of the story of mankind. The historical landscape is blurred by the ceaseless activity of its millions of professional ants. Now, we are world ecologists, and I don't wish to, and I mean no disrespect to ants. However, I do not like to think of myself as a professional sociological insect. Like Brodel and like Wallerstein, I'm interested in a single adventure of the mind, not in the sides of single cloth, but the entire complex cloth itself. Many years ago, Emmanuel Wallerstein wrote that there is only one solution to the deadly call of the sirens of cooptation. It is the renewal in the dangerous flames of the present, a renewal which is only possible through history, which alone can make it possible to live in a world of constant instability with reflexes other than those of fear. Now, this renewal is predicated on our resistance, and historical social science, the science of the past, the science of the present, is, in Faber's phrase, a combat. The world is in flames, and tomorrow, as Brodel feared, might indeed be too late. Now, I assume that most of you feel the same way. So my question to you becomes, and with this I will end, how should we best organize the collective renewal of the collective struggle in the dangerous flames of our present? Thank you.
That was incredible. I want to rewind so I can review the parts that are so provocative and thoughtful and generative in the sense of you've really made me think a lot. Does anyone want to start the questions? I certainly can, but I want people to have